Welcome back to Unfiltered, the podcast where we make international relations make sense. This week we have a very special guest joining us, Miss Sarayu Natarajan. Great to meet you again. Okay, to start this podcast episode, do you want to give an introduction of yourself?
Yes, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarayu. I am one of the co founders of Apti Institute. Though I'm on sabbatical from Apti now, I have a background in political science, in public policy, and in law. Though my career has taken many tracks. I have worked in management consulting. I have worked in venture capital investing until I found my way to doing what I do now, which is, co-run Apti. And that's a very brief description, but I think other than my interest in technology policy and technology in society, I have a deep interest in arts and culture and in sport. So in the evolution and the story of sport. So that's a quick description of me.
Okay, and just to start out, what first drew you to studying the intersection of policy and tech? And was there a particular experience or question that made you really want to pursue this area of research?
Yes, there's a story I tell, and there's, of course, a longer context within which that is embedded. The story is that I was doing my doctoral field work, and this was during the 2014 elections, but this was in a settlement of sorts outside Bangalore. And most of the people who lived in that settlement lived in tarpaulin homes. And as these go, this was a focus group discussion. I was with my a friend who was acting as a translator in that context. And as you do when you're doing field interviews, you have to pay people. And payment is not money or anything, but you have to pay in alcohol. So I had fought at a local liquor store and managed to procure bottles of alcohol, which I had then given to my respondents. So I had already given, and as a PhD student who was very conscious of budget, I was quite enthusiastic and keen to get a lot of value out of that conversation. But as things happened in Bangalore, it suddenly started raining, and it was this absurd amount of rain that was suddenly pouring down upon us, and everybody who was in the focus group discussion just upped and left. And I was, of course, my first concern, I will admit, was about the fact that I had already made the transaction. So I turned around to my friend and I was asking him, why did everybody leave so suddenly? And the answer was that they had to go protect the ID documentation, which is often kept in little plastic bags in their tarpaulin huts. And if water seeps through and their ID documents are messed up, what happens is that they have no recourse. They have no ability to access any kind of services. Increasingly, ration was starting to get linked to having some form of identity. So there's a whole range of access that becomes gone. And until then, I was quite a critic of ID systems and digital ID systems and what we understand as Aadhaar. But then I started to wonder about the relevance and the value of something that was attached to your body, and what did that mean? And that's not to walk away from any of the concerns, but is there sort of a deeper friction than I was imagining? And that's kind of what got me really interested in studying tech and society deeply. The context in which it was embedded, of course, is also relevant. I was doing my PhD and I was in the field all the time. I could see the effects of technology in every aspect of life. So Ola and Uber were just launching around then. There was a big digitization project that was happening. There was a lot happening on social media because the 2014 elections were quite significant in how much social media was central to the electoral campaign. So there was a lot that was happening that was very tech enabled or tech related or techie, and I felt the need to make sense of it. Very fortuitously, my co-founder was also having similar questions in her job, and somebody we were commonly bothering, I think we asked too many questions, said, you please talk to each other instead of bugging me, and that's started Apti. But I think it was a very fundamental sort of moment that happened. It was the context that it was embedded in, and the very fortuitous finding of my co-founder that all of this has come to be what it is.
Okay. And for listeners who may not be entirely familiar with your area of expertise, how would you explain what it is and why people just in general should care about it and look into it?
I think that's a very significant question. I think it's very easy to think of technology as this esoteric conversation that's happening outside our everyday lives. But I think there's a few reasons to sort of pay serious attention. One is that technology permeates, or digitization permeates, every aspect of our lives now, whether it is the ways in which you look for work and find work and then often do work, whether it is the engagement with the government or the state. You have to apply for a variety of things. Most of them are digitized. Um, Governance, which is ranging from traffic management to prediction of pandemics to cropping patterns. The state uses technology in very significant ways to govern better and deliver services to its citizens better. So there's, the relationship between citizen and state is techified, so to speak. And then if you think about our private engagement and conversations, there's an increasing datafication of that as well. So in all aspects of life, you are increasingly seeing technology play a central role. So that's one reason to pay attention to it, because there's no part of your life that is not technology driven in some way, that is not, or that is immune from the AI conversation, which is a whole other thing to talk about. But there's something there. The second, and I think it's a harder reason to grasp in some ways, because particularly in privileged rooms, there's a tendency to not think about marginality or vulnerability. So, and what I mean by that is that it's very easy if there's a certain amount of economic and educational privilege to say, well, this is not going to hurt me. But technology has this weird way of altering the margins or the boundaries of vulnerability, and they amplify existing challenges. And so just to give you an example, there's enormous amounts of research that documents how the elderly are particularly vulnerable to certain kinds of scams. They're particularly vulnerable to certain kinds of disinformation. So there's research that says the elderly, regardless of privilege, economic status, past employment, location, geography is irrelevant, are quite vulnerable to a certain kind of fraudulent behavior. Or information related challenges. The second is that young men, particularly those who are job seeking, are also vulnerable in their own way. Women face extraordinary amounts of abuse and misogyny online. So it is not that there is a single category that is not somehow affected by some of the predatory aspects of technology. And that is not to say, we should be scared or we should walk away from technology. That is in no way a call to be a Luddite. But I think a serious consideration of what technology means, how it intersects or refracts every aspect of our life, our relationships, is another reason for people to be attentive to it. I think the third is, I guess, a little bit even more abstracted, which is that the way modern technology is often made is that it's made by companies, and there is in parallel a sort of retreat by the state, which is governments are using technology to increase their efficiencies, but in some instances distancing themselves further and further away from citizens, which is, the idea of walking into a government office is quite, I dare say, surprising to many in my generation, and I'm sure it's even more magnified for those who are younger. So I think in that context, given that there is a atomization of every aspect of life, there's a retreat by the state in many instances. There are very big technology companies that are often not accountable in the ways that we understand accountability. That's another reason to pay attention, because this is This is something that affects us all. It increases the margins of vulnerability, and it's made through this very obscure process. Now, I want to be careful here. I think it's very tempting to say, you have the individual responsibility to make a radical change. And I don't disbelieve that. But I think there's a little bit of need to recognize that there is a system that is operating that is causing some of these challenges. So it's not just about individual action, but also about coming together, speaking across traditionally known boundaries, because this is not an India Tamil Nadu problem, for example, right? I'm recording this podcast as I'm sitting in the UK, and several of the debates here and in conversations relate to how much AI is sort of distorting, refracting, changing, affecting life. So I feel like, you shouldn't just frame it as individual responsibility, but as a collective sort of conversation that we need to have very seriously.
And with respect to a specific country, India is not only a major producer of AI related services, but also one of the world's largest and most diverse AI markets. In your opinion, how can India's scale and diversity kind of influence the way global AI systems are not only designed but governed as well?
Thank you. That's an interesting sort of shift to think about India's specific positionality, so to speak, in the context of AI. I think there's two parts to it. So the first is that we think of AI as this miraculous set of technological artifacts that is produced in some other part of the world. Particularly, the vision of China and the US as being quite central to it. And I want to sort of critique that notion a little bit, because actually the AI supply chain is fairly distributed. There are several actors that play very significant roles. Maybe they are small, but significant roles in the AI supply chain. So it is not so much linear, it is not so much concentrated, it is actually networked, right? And so, for example, Indian labor is quite central to the labeling of data for development of large language models, right? And to give you an example, for a driverless car to be built, the system has to consume vast amounts of data which says, this is a tree, or this is a footpath, or this is not a footpath, or this is a cow on the street, or whatever it is, right? So the algorithm has to be fed all of this, and the people who annotate that are human laborers sitting in India, usually, as in there's several geographies and there's a lot of literature talking about where this kind of work is done. But there's a centrality of people who are located outside where the AI is being produced or branded or labeled. And this happens in multiple ways. So, for example, in semiconductor manufacturing, elements of the supply chain are distributed all over the world. There are Japanese companies that are quite central to producing some kinds of ceramic that are essential for these semiconductors. So there's, again, at the risk of repetition, want to emphasize that we need to start thinking of AI as a networked system. So that's the first kind of major thought. The second is then coming to India's own role and India's own position on this. India has something to do on many elements of the supply chain. So if you think about strategic advantage, right, India's labor is quite central to labeling data sets. Without these labeled data sets, you can't really have quality in AI systems. Indian labor is quite central to the whole service economy. So the application layer, low cost sort of technology, I don't want to call it tinkering, but sort of building on core models, is often reliant on Indian companies. System integrators, often from India, play a big role in putting core technology into organizations. So you need an Infosys, for example, to take a model and then implement it in a car company, right? So you need elements of work that are done very strongly in India. So India is a robust services industry, as you probably know. So there's the second layer. And then the third is that India is a big consumer market, right? So all of these 3 points are points of leverage or points of the ability to shape debates and governance debates. The second part of the argument, and my co-founder has compellingly written about it in sort of several fora, is the idea that there is a need for a global south conversation on AI, because many economies in the global south play similar roles to India. So they're sometimes providing labor, sometimes providing technical talent, sometimes acting as large consumer markets. But there is a need for a global south sort of conversation. So India's role is in understanding this strategic advantage, in terms of how many places in the network it holds and how dependent elements of the network are on it, and then translating that into meaningful leadership, particularly thinking about what the voice of the global south means. And I think that should be sort of quite central in the thinking in Indian public policy around AI, and particularly in the framing of global governance norms.
Okay, and piggybacking off of that answer, in the future, what do you think success looks like for India and AI? Would that be technological breakthroughs, influence over governance, stronger domestic capabilities, or even something else entirely?
It's a good question. I have a slight sort of pushback against it, though. I mean, I think that very often trying to think of AI success may limit us to thinking only of the tools in the AI economy. And perhaps, given what we know of India's sort of economic development trajectory and current status, asking ourselves the question, what do we need to have outsized development for India's population with AI as a tool, becomes a way to ask the question. So you say, okay, what does India need over the next 30 to 50 years? In terms of capabilities, in terms of businesses, in terms of economic investments, whatever it is, what is that set of things that India needs to do wonderful things for its citizens in the next 50 years, right? 50 years is make it 30, you can make it 80, and the conversation still is somewhat similar. But the conversation then becomes about development, of which AI is a part. Because the challenge with some of the conversations around AI that we see is that the moment you think of only the upsides of it, you become a little hesitant and resistant to working on the downsides in a serious way. And there are downsides, ranging from information to safety to, and this is again, I suppose, a whole other podcast episode to discuss some of the risks of AI. There are downsides, and the moment you're saying, oh, we want to make sure that we do this well, you may not think so much about where the harms are. But if you say, hey, how do we do this in a way that is best for all of our citizens, so the best for the maximum number of citizens possible, then we start to ask questions about both the good and the bad. Then you think seriously about the labor, which is quite a central part of the Indian economy, the annotation labor and the services industry. You also think on the other side about information vulnerability, fraudulent issues around fraud, harm, etc. So I hope that answered your question, but I think that the AI story cannot or must not just be about we will do semiconductors. I know India signed Pax Silica, so it should not just be about semiconductors. It should not just be about AI, or it should not just be about one aspect of AI, but rather thinking of AI as a lever or a tool to drive broader growth and development.
Now, moving on, throughout your work and your research, were there any findings that genuinely surprised you or challenged one of your assumptions, whether it be AI, geopolitics, or even just regular work that you do?
I feel like there are so many things that have challenged my assumptions. I am finding it hard to name one, but one that very quickly comes to mind, or rather very often comes to mind, was when I started out at Apti. I definitely did. I don't want to speak for my co-founder or the rest of my colleagues, but I had this view that certain companies were bad, or certain technologies were problematic, or they were inherently to be neglected. Since we do a lot of work on technology and labor and gig work and the platform economy, more broadly speaking, I translated that to saying, hey, we must be very cautious when we engage with platform companies. But at some point of time, we did a piece of work on trying to understand the state of work or the worker experiences in the context of ride hail and personal services, basically location-based services. And then a few months after that, Uber in India reached out to us to have a serious conversation about setting up a driver advisory council and for us to act as the internal review board for it, which meant that the driver advisory council for the 2 years or so that it was in operation became a place for drivers from across the country to come and speak with each other and speak with Uber. So it was a mediated setting. Speak with each other about what kinds of changes they needed, etc. And so there was elements of product feedback. There was elements of, most like seat at the table kind of fundamental design questions. It also was a way to have global conversations about what it meant to have local technology. So it was an interesting one. And starting out at Apti, I would have never thought it possible. But I do think that as people who are thinking seriously about the effects of technology and thinking seriously about policy, finding these middle efforts that are not necessarily regulation but are not necessarily something else either is meaningful and relevant to do. And it was a very fundamental, like assumption, call it obdurate belief, whatever you would, but I think that has changed. But I think there's a lot of other smaller ones. I honestly did not anticipate the pace at which large language models would be very central to everyday life. I would have thought it was 5 years ahead, but I feel like it's here now, and a more serious consideration of some of these questions is warranted now, rather than thinking of it as even a medium-term question. So, but there's quite a few. But I think these are a couple of the central ones that come to mind.
And just to wrap it up, the final question, for students who are interested in tech and policy but aren't entirely sure where to begin, do you have any general advice or broad advice to give them, or are there any specific books or habits or even just ways of thinking that helped shape your own career?
I think there's a few things. One is, of course, all the good stuff, right? Which is read, be curious. There are, of course, a few books which I'm happy to share as a note separately, but there's books to read, there are Substacks to follow, there are podcasts to listen to. And I suppose my broad provocation there would be to say, be curious, keep trying to find new things, even things that you instinctively disagree with, because you never know, what might resonate over a period of time. And so the broad motto is be curious, read the news, keep track of things. And in all of this, I would also say, think very seriously about the mode which you use to express yourself. I think that very long I have believed, and perhaps this goes to your last question of an assumption that has changed. I thought, the text or the written word is the final way to the only way to document your thoughts. But I feel like there's a lot more opportunities and ways and pathways available for expressing ideas, and this could be through what you're doing, such as this podcast. It could be through art, it could be through performance, it could be through I don't even know what else, but I feel like there is some consideration for what methodology to use. I think in all of that though, so of course be curious, be good, be thoughtful. This is really not I don't want to do a LinkedIn style post telling you these are 10 things to do. I don't have 10 ideas. But I do think in all of it, what has really stood by me is the fact that my own views are very much shaped by the disciplines that I have studied, right? So, very seriously, that I've studied the law, I've studied political science, I have a ability to think in public policy terms, which means economics, and these disciplines and these I dare say philosophical orientations have been the baseline of how I think about technology. So I think having a grounding in a discipline is a meaningful way to build your engagement with tech and policy. So that's the sort of thing that I'd like to leave people with. And I think there's a third, which is slightly, it sounds like, people screaming all the time. But I do think that if you want to do policy, you want to do tech policy especially, you must know tech. I think it has become very evident in some conversations where there are people who know technology and people who don't, that the people who don't uh, find their critiques. You might be right, but may not have the right vocabulary with which to express critiques, or may not have the right, even sometimes the right orientation. And so it's dismissed and not taken seriously. So I think having the philosophical grounding in some discipline, which whatever it is, it doesn't matter, but it's some kind of saying, I think about things, this is my worldview, it may not be the best, but I have this. And then also understanding technology quite well. I don't think we have a choice anymore, especially if you're interested in tech policy, that you can say, I don't care about understanding this, it all works the same. It may or it may not, but you at least need to know the language. So I think if you want 3 pillars, maybe the LinkedIn post is writing itself, right? So be curious, find a disciplinary orientation, and then learn about technology.
Okay, that's all the questions I had planned, but the, all of it was so incredibly informative and interesting. That's all I had for today's episode, but thank you so much for joining me. It was such a pleasure to have you. I definitely look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you, Amiya. This was a great conversation.
That's it for today's episode of Unfiltered. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to like and follow the podcast and stay tuned for future episodes. Thank you.